When a young woman is thrown out of her own home on her 19th birthday, her stepmother tells her the only thing she has left in the world is the keys to her late mother's abandoned bakery, a place she's been told for years is nothing but a rotting shell full of broken dreams. But what she finds locked inside the walk-in freezer wasn't just a piece of the past. It was the beginning of a future no one believed she deserved. If you've ever been written off, underestimated, or made to feel like you didn't belong in your own life, this story is for you. So stay with me, and maybe hit that subscribe button, because sometimes the things people throw away are the very things that save us. The keys felt heavier than they had any right to be. 3 of them on a tarnished silver ring, the kind my mother used to clip to the belt loop of her flour-dusted apron. 1 was a long brass key for the front door. 1 was a stubby bronze one for the back. And the 3rd, smaller, colder, etched with the name of a refrigeration company that probably didn't even exist anymore, was for the walk-in freezer. I knew that without having to be told. I had watched my mother thread that exact key onto that exact ring 100 times before she died. Diane had dropped them onto the marble of the kitchen island the morning of my 19th birthday, like she was getting rid of expired coupons. "There," she said in that thin, clipped voice she used whenever she was pretending to be civil. "That's everything your mother left for you. Congratulations, Maya. You're an adult. Time to act like one." I stared at the keys. "I didn't pick them up. You're kicking me out." "I'm releasing you," she corrected, smoothing the front of her cashmere sweater like the conversation had wrinkled it. "Your father, God rest him, would have wanted you to be independent. The house belongs to me now. The account belonged to me. The car belongs to me. But your mother's little business," she said business like it was a contagious disease, "that she put in your name, so that's your inheritance. Enjoy." She slid a manila envelope across the marble. The deed, a folder of unpaid invoices, a property tax notice stamped in red, and a printed listing from a real estate firm called Halbert Holdings offering to take the building off my hands for $42,000 cash. No inspection, no contingencies, signed by the end of the week. "I've spoken with their representative," Diane said. "He's a very reasonable man. Sign the papers, take the money. Get yourself a little apartment somewhere. Start fresh. We can both move on." I finally looked up at her. She was wearing my mother's pearl earrings. I didn't say anything about the earrings. I had learned in 3 years of living under her roof that pointing things out only made things worse. Diane had a way of taking a small, true observation and turning it into evidence of how ungrateful you were, how difficult, how impossible to live with. I had learned to keep small, true things to myself. I had learned to fold them up and put them away and pretend, in front of her, that I had never seen them at all. So I said nothing about the earrings. Instead, I picked up the keys, picked up the envelope, picked up the duffel bag I had already, somehow, instinctively packed the night before, as if some part of me had known this was coming, and I walked out the front door of the only house I had left. The lock clicked behind me with finality that, in a strange way, felt less like an ending and more like a door being shut on a room that had been on fire for a very long time. It was just past 7 in the morning. The October air had teeth. I had $318 in my checking account, a phone that was about to fall off the family plan, a duffel bag with 4 sweaters and 2 pairs of jeans, and a set of keys to a building I hadn't set foot in for almost 5 years. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the cul-de-sac and sat on the bench and let myself cry exactly once, for exactly 2 minutes, the way my mother had taught me. 2 minutes, Maya. Then you wash your face and you get to work. It had been her rule for everything. Bad grades, bad days, bad news. She used to time it on her wristwatch. She used to say grief was a guest you had to feed, but only at scheduled meals, or would eat you out of house and home. When the bus came, I got on it. My mother had owned a bakery called Sunday Hours. That was the whole name, just Sunday Hours. She used to laugh about it, said it was the name of her favorite feeling in the world, the slow gold light of a Sunday morning when the whole town was still asleep, and the only thing in the world that mattered was whether the sourdough had risen. She had opened the place in a small downtown storefront on Linden Street the year I was born, and for 12 years it was the warmest, brightest, busiest place I knew. The cinnamon rolls came out of the oven at 6. The morning regulars came in at 6:30. By 9, the place smelled like butter and yeast and good coffee, and people my mother actually knew the names of. She knew everybody's name. That was the thing about her. She knew the names of the man who brought the milk, and the woman who walked her terrier past a window every morning at 7, and the high school kid who washed dishes for her on Saturdays, and the retired postman who came in every single day for the same drip coffee and the same blueberry muffin, and never once said thank you, because my mother said he didn't have to. He says it by coming back, Maya. Then she got sick. She fought it for 2 years. She kept the bakery open as long as she could, but at the end she was too tired to stand at the bench anymore, and she closed the doors on a Sunday, fittingly, in October, almost exactly 6 years to the day before I was sitting on that bus. She died 4 months later. My father, who had been quiet and gentle and a little bit lost his whole life, met Diane at a grief support group 8 months after that. They were married within the year. He died of a heart attack at his desk 3 years later. And somehow, by some sleight of legal hand, I had been too young and too tired and too sad to understand, everything he owned became hers. Everything except the bakery. The bakery? My mother had put in a small irrevocable trust a month before she died. Just for Maya. She had written a card I still kept folded in my wallet, for when she's ready. I had not been ready. I had been 16, and then 17, and then 18, and the bakery had sat boarded up on Linden Street the whole time, and Diane had told me, over and over again, every time property tax notices arrived, that it was a useless burden, a money pit, a hazard, a liability, that the smart thing, the adult thing, was to sell it the second I came of age. And here I was, an adult, by her clock, by 2 hours. I got off the bus on the corner of Linden and 4th. The downtown was older than I remembered, or maybe just smaller. Half the storefronts on the block were dark. A laundromat, a tax preparer's office that had gone out of business, a vape shop that hadn't existed when I was a kid. And there in the middle of the block, with a sun-faded for sale by owner sign taped lopsided in the window. My window, I realized, my sign. Somebody else had put that sign there without asking me. Was Sunday hours. The cream-colored awning was streaked with rust. The big front window was filthy, the glass clouded with 5 years of grime. Someone had spray-painted a tag on the brick beside the door, and someone else had tried to scrub it off and only made it worse. The hand-painted sign above the door, my mother had paid a local artist $100 and a dozen croissants to make it, had faded so badly you could barely read the words. A pigeon had built a nest in the corner of the awning. A flyer for a yard sale that had probably happened 3 years ago was still stapled to the doorframe. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time. I thought about Diane's offer. $42,000. It was, in that moment, more money than I had ever seen in my life. It would pay first, last, and security on a small apartment. It would buy me a used car. It would let me sleep at night. It would let me eat. It would let me, maybe, go back to community college in the spring. It would let me be a normal 19-year-old, the kind who has a roommate and a part-time job and complains about midterms. And it would erase my mother from this block forever. I took the keys out of my pocket. The brass one slid into front door lock and turned with a gritty reluctance, like the building itself was deciding whether to let me in. The door stuck for a second on the swollen frame, then gave. A wave of stale, cold, faintly sweet air rolled out into the street. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the light. October sun was coming in through the dirty front window in long pale bars, lighting up the dust in the air like snow. The second thing was the smell, not bad, not really, just old. Old flour, old sugar, old wood. Underneath it, very faintly, almost like a memory, was the smell of vanilla. Everything was still there. The long glass display case where the croissants and the morning buns used to live, empty now, smudged with old fingerprints. The 4 little round cafe tables with their mismatched chairs. The chalkboard menu still listing prices from 2019 in my mother's looping handwriting. Cinnamon roll $3.50. Drip coffee $2. Sunday special Ask Maya. That last line broke something in my chest. She used to let me, when I was 8 or 9, invent a Sunday special every weekend. Sometimes it was a real pastry. Sometimes it was just a cookie with too many sprinkles. She wrote it on the board anyway. Ask Maya. I walked behind the counter. The espresso machine was still bolted to the back bar, dusty but intact. The mixer, a big red KitchenAid commercial mixer that had been my mother's pride and joy, sat on the workbench under a yellow plastic sheet. The shelves above were still stocked with metal bowls and dough scrapers and rolling pins, all of it furred with 5 years of dust, but otherwise undisturbed. Whoever had closed this place, and I knew with a small dull pain that it had been my mother herself on her last good day, had closed it the way you close a book you intend to come back to, not the way you close a chapter that's over. The way you close a chapter you mean to finish. The kitchen was through a swinging door at the back. The 2 ovens, the proofing cabinet, the big stainless work table I used to sit on as a kid, swinging my legs while my mother shaped baguettes. And in the corner, humming faintly, somehow, after 5 years, was the walk-in freezer. I stopped. I listened. It was running. Quietly, steadily. Tick, tick. Someone had been paying the electric bill on this place for 5 years. I walked to the breaker panel by the back door and opened it. The main was on. The freezer circuit was on. Everything else, lights, ovens, water heater, had been switched off. Whoever had done this had wanted the freezer, and only the freezer kept alive. I felt the back of my neck go cold. The walk-in was a heavy stainless door with a long industrial handle and that small bronze keyhole. I fitted the 3rd key. It turned smoothly, like it had been used recently. I pulled the handle, and the seal broke with a soft pneumatic whump, and a wall of cold, dry air rolled out around my ankles. I stepped inside. The walk-in was the size of a small bathroom. Wire shelves lined 3 walls. The 4th wall, the one opposite the door, was solid stainless steel. The shelves were almost completely empty. A few bags of frozen butter, brown with freezer burn, a stack of old sheet pans, a labeled tub of something that had once been pie filling. But on the middle shelf of the back wall, at exactly the height of my eyes, was a metal box. It was an old recipe tin, powder blue with white daisies on the lid. The kind of thing my mother might have bought at an estate sale in 1998. It was dusted in a thin layer of frost, but otherwise it was clean. Clean in a way nothing else in the building was clean. Someone had put it here, recently, or at least recently enough that the frost was still soft. A small white envelope was taped to the top. In my mother's handwriting, in blue ballpoint, 2 words. For Maya. My hands were shaking so hard I had to put the tin down on the shelf again to open the envelope. There was a single folded sheet of paper inside, lined notebook paper, the kind I used to do my homework on at the corner table while she closed up. Maya, if you're reading this, then you are old enough to find me. I'm sorry I couldn't wait for you. I'm sorry the house wasn't enough to keep you safe. I knew it wouldn't be. I told your father, before I went, that the woman he was going to marry would not love you the way I did. He didn't believe me, and I forgave him for that, because grief makes us stupid. But I plan anyway. This place is yours, not the building. The building is just a building. What's yours is in the tin. Read everything. Read it in order. I love you more than there are words in any language. Be brave, my Sunday girl. Mom. I sat down on the cold tile floor of the walk-in with the tin in my lap, and I opened it. It was full of envelopes, not letters, exactly, though there were a few of those marked with dates. First birthday after I'm gone. 18th, 21st, wedding day if you have one, day you doubt yourself. Those I set aside, with hands that were shaking again for later. Underneath the letters was a stack of recipe cards. Hundreds of them. My mother's handwriting on every single one, not just bakery recipes. Though those were there too, the cinnamon roll dough, the croissant lamination schedule, the sourdough starter feed she had named Agnes, but a complete book. Notes in the margins. Don't trust a thermometer, trust your finger. This one is Mrs. Halloran's recipe. She gave it to me. Always credit her. If the kitchen smells like butter, and you can hear the radio, the day is going right. Maya, when you make this, double the salt. Trust me, the recipe is wrong, and I never fixed it. That last one made me laugh out loud in the freezer. A single shock sound that bounced off the steel walls. She had known. She had known I would be the one reading these. Not a stranger. not a buyer. Me, it was a working manual for a bakery. Her bakery, written. I realized as I flipped through and saw the dates penciled at the corners of the cards, in the last 6 months of her life, when she could no longer stand at the bench, but could still sit at the kitchen table and write. She had written me a bakery. Underneath the recipes was a manila folder. I opened it. My breath caught. Inside was a photocopy of the trust paperwork, my mother's bakery trust, in my name, irrevocable, untouchable, signed and notarized 2 months before she died. Stapled to it was a letter from a lawyer named Patricia Yoon, at a small firm 3 blocks away, dated the previous spring. Maya, your mother retained me before her passing to monitor this property on your behalf. The annual property taxes have been paid out of a small reserve fund she left with this office. The electricity for the walk-in unit has been maintained on the same fund. The reserve will be exhausted in March of next year. Please contact me at your earliest convenience after your 19th birthday. There is more I am required to tell you in person. There was a phone number, and underneath the folder, at the very bottom of the tin, was a thick brown envelope sealed. I opened it. It was cash. Not a fortune. Not the kind of money that buys a house or a car or a different life. But it was real, and it was a lot. Banded 50s and 20s, the kind of stack that takes years of careful saving to put together, with a sticky note on top of my mother's handwriting that said, seed money, for flour, for light bills, for a second chance, not for rent. Maya, find a place to bake first. The place to sleep will follow. M. I counted it later, sitting on the floor of the kitchen with the late afternoon sun coming sideways through the window. $11,400. I cried for a long time, not the 2-minute cry of the morning. A long, ragged, ugly cry that I let happen because there was no one in the building to hear me, and because I had not, in 3 years of living in Diane's house, allowed myself to cry like that even once. I cried until my throat hurt. I cried until the sun moved across the floor and the bars of light changed angle. I cried for my mother, who had been dying, who had known she was dying, and who had spent her last months on earth not feeling sorry for herself, but writing recipes for a child she would never get to teach in person. I cried for my father, who had been good and weak and gone too soon and who had failed, in the end, to protect me from the woman he had let into our house. I cried for the girl I had been at 16, sitting in a bedroom with the door closed, listening to Diane on the phone with a real estate agent talking about the property. I cried for myself at 19, on a tile floor in a building I owned, with a tin full of letters and the first real evidence in 3 years that I had been loved on purpose. When I was done, I washed my face in the kitchen sink. The water sputtered rust for a minute and then ran clear, and I called Patricia Yoon. She picked up on the second ring. Maya, she said, before I had said anything, your mother told me you'd call today. I want to stop here for a second, because this was the moment. If you have ever been in a place where you thought you were completely alone, where you thought everyone who loved you was gone or had given up, or had never been on your side at all, I want you to hear this. Sometimes love arrives late. Sometimes it arrives in cold storage. Sometimes the people who love you most planned, quietly and carefully and without any applause, for the worst day of your life, in the hope that on that day you would find what they left. If that idea means something to you, if you have ever been the person who needed a letter from someone who is already gone, please consider subscribing. This channel is for people who know that hope sometimes hides in plain sight, behind a freezer door under a daisy lid. Your subscription helps me tell more of these stories. And now, let me tell you what Patricia Yoon said. Patricia Yoon's office was above a flower shop. She was somewhere in her 50s, with iron gray hair cut short in a gentle, no-nonsense manner that reminded me, painfully, of my mother. She made me a cup of tea before she said anything important, which I would later learn was just how she did things. Your mother was my client for the last year of her life, she said, settling across the desk from me. And I want to be clear, Maya, I have been keeping an eye on you on this property and on Diane Mercedes for almost 3 years. I stared at her. On Diane. She slid a folder across the desk. It was thicker than it should have been. Your mother instructed me, before she died, to monitor any attempt by your father's future spouse. She was very specific about the wording, to encumber, sell, or transfer the bakery property without your written consent. Diane has tried 4 times. 4. Once when your father was still alive, she had him sign a document she claimed was a household refinance. It would have folded the bakery into a joint marital asset. Your father, to his credit, brought it to me first. I shredded it. She tapped the folder. 3 times since his death. Most recently, 3 weeks ago, she approached a developer called Halber Holdings and represented herself as the trustee. She isn't. She has never been. The trust is yours and only yours, and any document she signed about that building is not worth the paper it's printed on. I felt my stomach turn over. The $42,000 offer. I said, Halbert is a holding company for a man named Russell Merrick. He's a small-time predator. He targets distressed downtown properties owned by inheritors, young people, mostly people who don't know what they have. He offers cash. He flips the buildings to a development partner for 3 to 4 times what he paid. The Linden Street block has been on his list for 2 years, and yours is the keystone. Corner exposure, original facade, full basement. Maya, this building, in its current condition, is worth somewhere between $140,000 and $170,000. As a working bakery with a renewed lease on life and a year of income, it could be worth more than twice that. I didn't know what to say. The numbers didn't feel real. None of it felt real. Diane doesn't know I exist, by the way, Patricia added, with the smallest hint of a smile. Your mother wanted it that way. I am, as far as Diane is concerned, a ghost. Today is the first day I am authorized to move. She slid another piece of paper across the desk. This is a cease and desist, drafted and ready to send to Halber Holdings and to Diane personally. It informs them that any further attempts to negotiate the sale of this property or to interfere with your trusteeship will be met with civil litigation. Your mother prepaid for it. All it needs is your signature. I picked up the pen. I want to tell you that my hand was steady. It wasn't. But I signed it anyway, and Patricia took the paper back and put it in an envelope and dropped in her outgoing mail tray like it was nothing, like it was a utility bill. Like it was the simplest thing in the world to push back against a woman who had spent 3 years telling me I was nothing. Now, she said, folding her hands, let's talk about what you actually want to do. I went home that night to a hostel 2 blocks from the bakery, which cost me $32, and I slept harder than I had slept in 3 years. I slept the way you sleep after running for a long time, and finally, sitting down, I dreamed about my mother. I don't remember what she said. I remember she was laughing. The next morning, I went back to Sunday hours with a bucket and a mop and a box of trash bags. It was October. By Patricia's reserve calendar, I had until March before the lights got cut. By my own calculation, $11,400 in seed money, plus $318 in checking, plus whatever I could save on rent by sleeping on a cot in the back office. I had maybe 4 months to figure out whether I could actually open a bakery. I had no idea how to open a bakery. I knew how to help in one. I had spent every Saturday morning of my childhood weighing flour and folding parchment and pulling trays. I knew the rhythm of a bakery, the way some kids know the rhythm of their parents' arguments. But running one, payroll, permits, suppliers, the health inspector, the gas company, the workers' comp, the point-of-sale system, the credit card processing fees, the bag of decisions you have to make every single day before the doors are even open, was a different country, and I didn't speak the language. I called Patricia on the second day. I told her I didn't know if I could do this. She said, Maya, you don't have to know. You just have to start. Your mother left you a manual. Use it. So I did. I started on the front room. I took down the for sale by owner sign and threw it in the dumpster in the alley with more force than was strictly necessary. I washed the front window. It took 3 passes with vinegar until you could see clear through to the chalkboard menu in my mother's handwriting, which I left up on purpose because looking at it made me feel like she was in the room. I scrubbed the display case until the glass squeaked. I oiled the door hinges. I bought a $40 can of paint at the hardware store on the corner and repainted the trim around the front window, the same warm cream it had been when I was a kid. I had to mix the color twice to get it right. I had asked a man at the paint counter, who was probably 60 and had an enormous gray mustache, to help me figure out how much I needed, because I didn't know, and he didn't make me feel stupid about it. And I almost cried at the hardware store register, which would have been embarrassing for both of us. People started to notice. A woman named Linda from the dry cleaner, 2 doors down, knocked on the glass on the 3rd afternoon. She brought me a thermos of soup. She said, "You're Helen's girl, aren't you?" I thought I recognized that nose. She had been my mother's friend for 15 years. She had assumed, like everyone else on the block, that the bakery was gone for good. She cried a little when I told her I was trying to reopen. Then she went home and came back an hour later with a list of every supplier my mother used to buy from, written from memory on the back of a dry cleaning ticket. Heller's Flour, ask for Mike. He'll do net 30. Riverside Dairy, the woman is named Carol. She remembers your mom. The fish guy at the Tuesday market does our parchment. Don't ask why. A man named Dev from the tax repairer's office across the street brought me a coffee on day 5 and asked, in the careful diplomatic way of a man who's been a small business neighbor for a long time, whether I thought about a business license, an EIN, a food handler's permit, a liability policy, a state sales tax registration, and what I planned to do about the sidewalk easement that the city was probably going to ask me about within 90 days. I had thought about exactly none of these. He sat down at one of the dusty cafe tables and walked me through every single one. He drew a checklist on the back of a napkin. 3 days later, when I went to the city clerk's office, I had a folder so neat the clerk laughed and said it was the most prepared first-timer she'd seen all year, a retired baker named Marisol. She had run a panaderia on the next block for 30 years before her knees gave out, heard from Linda that I was trying to reopen, and showed up unannounced one morning with a battered copy of a commercial baking textbook and a pair of reading glasses, and the words, "I'll come for 2 hours a day until you don't need me. I'm not getting paid. Don't argue." I didn't argue. She taught me, over the course of those 2 hours, every morning for 6 weeks, all the things that aren't on a recipe card. How to read dough with the back of your hand. How to tell when an oven is lying to you. How to portion a sheet so you don't waste a single inch. How to talk to a flour rep on the phone so they don't try to upsell you. Mija. She said one morning, watching me knead a batch of brioche the 3rd time, because I had wrecked the first 2. Your hands already know. You just have to stop apologizing to them. Diane, of course, didn't take it lying down. 3 days after Patricia sent the cease and desist, I got a phone call from Russell Merrick of Halberd Holdings himself. He was charming for about 20 seconds, and then he wasn't. He told me I was making a serious mistake. He told me the building had structural issues he was being kind enough to overlook in his offer. He told me I was a teenage girl trying to play a businesswoman, and I was going to lose everything. And when I did, his offer would not be on the table anymore. I told him to talk to my lawyer. The line went quiet for a second. Then he laughed, a hard, surprised laugh, and he said, "You have a lawyer?" "I have a lawyer," I said. "Her name is Patricia Yoon. My mother hired her 4 years ago, specifically for you." He hung up. Diane came in person. 2 weeks in. I was on a step stool, wiping down the top of the display case when I saw her car pull up at the curb. She got out and stood on the sidewalk for a long minute, just staring at the front window. The cream trim was fresh. The chalkboard was clean. The lights, I had paid a deposit to get the rest of the building's electric back on the day before, were warm and yellow inside. It looked, for the first time in 5 years, like a place where a person might want to walk in. She came in. She did not say hello. "This is insane," she said. I climbed down off the stool. "I know what you've been doing," I said. Patricia told me everything. She didn't ask who Patricia was. That was how I knew she already knew. "Maya, you are 19 years old. You have no money, no experience, no employees, no idea what you're doing. You're going to fail spectacularly, and you're going to lose everything. And this is going to be 10 times more painful for you than just taking the offer would have been." "Maybe," I said. She blinked. I think she had been expecting me to argue. I think she had been counting on me to argue, the way I used to argue, badly and tearfully, when I was 16 and 17, and she still had me cornered in her kitchen. "Maybe I'll fail," I said, "but it's going to be my failure, not yours. You don't get to make decisions about this place. You never did." She opened her mouth and closed it. I noticed then that she was not wearing my mother's pearls. I wondered, briefly, if Patricia had something to do with that, too. Later I would learn that, yes, in fact, she did, that my mother had photographed every piece of jewelry in her box and left the photographs with Patricia along with notarized inventory. And that Patricia, in the same week she sent the cease and desist to Halberd, had sent a much shorter, much more clinical letter to Diane regarding the listed personal effects of the late Helen Reyes. I never had to ask for the pearls. They came in a padded envelope to Patricia's office 2 weeks later. Diane left without saying goodbye. I locked the door behind her, and I leaned against it, and I laughed. I didn't even know I was going to laugh. It just came out of me, a real laugh, the first one I could remember in 3 years. It echoed in the empty bakery and bounced off the tin ceiling, and came back to me sounding like somebody I used to know. The bakery opened on the first Sunday of February. Not officially. Officially, the grand reopening was scheduled for the middle of March, when a new oven I had financed would be installed, when a new menu would be printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, when a freshly painted sign would be hung above the front door in the same shade of soft sage green my mother had chosen 23 years ago. Officially, there were still permits to finalize, inspections to pass, a small mountain of paperwork sitting on the corner of my desk that I kept meaning to get to. But on the first Sunday of February, just to see if I could, just to prove to myself that the woman who had spent the last 4 months scrubbing grout and arguing with contractors and lying awake at 2 a.m. wondering if she had made the worst decision of her life was still, somewhere underneath all that, a baker. I baked a single batch of my mother's cinnamon rolls. Her recipe card was the third one in the tin, slightly stained with butter, the corners softened from 20 years of being pulled out and put back. Her handwriting, which I had not seen in 5 years, hit me harder than I expected. The little loops on her lowercase l's, the way she always underlined the word butter twice, as if reminding herself, or me, that this was the part that mattered. I put a hand-lettered sign in the front window. I made it the night before, with a black marker and a piece of butcher paper, and it said, "Free cinnamon roll, today only, first 20 people, in memory of Helen Reyes." I made the dough the night before. I let it rise on top of the warm water heater because I didn't trust the proofing cabinet yet. It was new and shiny, and I hadn't yet developed a relationship with it that you have to develop with any piece of equipment that decides every morning whether or not your day is going to go well. I rolled the dough out at 4 a.m. on the big stainless work table, the same table my mother had rolled dough on for 2 decades, and the metal was cold under my forearms, and the kitchen smelled the way it had always smelled. Even after 5 years of being closed, yeast and butter, and the faintest ghost of cinnamon, soaked permanently into the wood of the shelves and the grout between the floor tiles. And I cried when I tasted the first one. Not almost, exactly like hers. The recipe was a recipe, and my hands, it turned out, remembered. They remembered the weight of the dough, the temperature of the butter, the precise number of turns when folding in the cinnamon sugar. They remembered things my conscious mind had long since forgotten. I baked 20 rolls. I gave away every single one before 9 a.m. Linda came. Linda, who had run the flower shop next door for 31 years, who had hugged me at my mother's funeral so hard I thought my ribs would crack, who had brought me a casserole every Sunday for 2 months afterward, even though I told her she didn't have to. Dev came, in his postal uniform, on his way to start his route, and he ate his cinnamon rolls standing at the counter and didn't say a single word, just nodded at me with his mouth full and his eyes wet, and squeezed my shoulder on his way out the door. Marisol came and stood in the back of the kitchen and watched me work, and didn't say anything except, at the end, "Your mother would cry, Maya." In a good way. She had been my mother's closest friend, the one who had organized the meal train, the one who had sat with her in the hospice during the final week. She had not set foot in this kitchen since the day my mother died. She stayed for 45 minutes, leaning against the doorframe, watching me move between the oven and the work table, and when she finally left, she pressed her hand to my cheek and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. A man I didn't know came in and told me he used to bring his daughter here every Sunday before school, that they would split a cinnamon roll and a hot chocolate at the little table by the window, and his daughter was now 26, and a nurse working the night shift at a hospital 3 states away, and he was going to call her tonight and tell her the place was open again. He cried. I cried. We were two strangers crying over pastry at 7:30 in the morning, and neither of us was embarrassed. A woman I didn't know came in and just stood at the counter and cried for a minute, silently, with her hands flat on the marble, and then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and asked if she could buy a loaf of bread next week. I told her gently that I wouldn't have bread for sale until March. She nodded. She said she would wait. She said it like a promise. By March, I had two part-time employees, a college student named Priya, who worked weekends, and a recently retired schoolteacher named Frank, who came in 3 mornings a week because he said he had spent 40 years standing in front of children, and now he wanted to spend his retirement standing in front of a bread oven. I had a full bread program. Sourdough, country loaves, baguettes on weekends, a dark rye that I had developed myself in the weeks before opening, in honor of my grandfather, who had been a baker before my mother was. I had a contract with a coffee roaster 2 towns over, a young couple who had started their business in a garage, and who took 1 sip of my mother's espresso brownies and signed the papers on the spot. I had a line out the door on Saturdays. By June, I was paying myself an actual wage. Not a generous one, but an actual one. The first month, I deposited a paycheck into my own account. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for 15 minutes and just stared at the receipt. By August, I had hired a 3rd employee, a kid named Theo who wanted to be a pastry chef and who reminded me painfully of myself at 16, all elbows and nervous energy and too much hope, asking too many questions, apologizing every time he made a mistake, even when the mistake was mine. I tried to be patient with him in the ways my mother had been patient with me. I try to remember that the most important thing she ever taught me was not technique, not timing, not the precise temperature for laminating dough, but how to fail in a kitchen without losing your nerve. By the following October, exactly 1 year from the morning Diane had dropped the keys on the marble counter and walked out without saying goodbye. Exactly 1 year from the morning my entire life had narrowed to a single ring of keys and a powder blue tin and a freezer in the back. I was sleeping in a small 1-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from a bakery, with a window that faced a maple tree that was just beginning to turn. The cot in the back office had been replaced by a real desk with a real laptop and a real chair that didn't make my back ache. I had finally, after a full year of putting it off, opened the 2nd letter in the tin, the one labeled, in my mother's careful handwriting, "Day you doubt yourself." It said, in part, "Maya, if you are reading this, it means you have done something hard, and somewhere in the doing of it, you stopped believing you could. I want you to know that I never stopped believing, not for one day. I baked for 22 years, and the only thing I learned that mattered is this. The dough doesn't care if you're tired. The dough just wants to rise. You just have to give it warmth and time. Be the warmth, Maya. The time will take care of itself." I keep that letter in the drawer of the cash register now. I read it on bad days. There are still bad days. There will always be bad days. The walk-in broke down in July and cost me $4,000 I did not have, and I had to call the loan officer at the bank and ask for an extension on a payment. And I cried in the bathroom afterward for 10 minutes, and then washed my face and went back out front and sold a dozen scones to a tour group. A health inspector failed me on a paperwork technicality in September, a missing logbook entry, 3 days unaccounted for in the cooling records, and I had to close for 3 days while I corrected it, and I lost a wedding cake order I had been counting on. Theo cut his hand badly in November, slicing into his palm with a bread knife on a slow Tuesday afternoon, and I drove him to the emergency room with flowers still in my hair and a streak of egg wash on my apron. And I sat in the waiting room for 2 hours holding his other hand, because his mother lived 4 hours away and he was scared. Some mornings I wake up at 3:45 before the alarm, and I lie in the dark for 30 seconds, sometimes longer, before I can convince my body to get out of bed. The body remembers what the mind forgets, that this is hard, that this never stops being hard, that the dough doesn't care if you slept badly or your back hurts or you are still, somewhere underneath everything, a girl who lost her mother too young. But here is what my mother taught me, in the end, with the quietest, most patient inheritance I can imagine, an inheritance she planned in the last months of her life, when most people would have been too tired to plan anything at all, when she was already losing weight, already unable to stand at the counter for more than 20 minutes, already saying goodbye to a life she was not finished living. The people who tell you that you have nothing are almost never the ones who actually know what you have. Diane, my mother's sister, the executor of the estate, the woman who handled the paperwork in the months after the funeral with a brisk efficiency that I mistook at the time for grief, looked at that building and saw $42,000 in deferred maintenance and a nuisance she didn't want to deal with. Russell Merrick, the developer who tried to buy it from her 3 different times that first year, looked at it and saw a flip, a tear down, a parcel, a number on a spreadsheet. Even I, on the morning of my 19th birthday, when Diane finally signed the keys over to me with an expression that suggested she was doing me a favor she did not particularly believe in, looked at that ring of keys and saw a burden, a box of someone else's grief I would now have to carry. None of us could see what was actually there. What was actually there was a woman who had loved me so completely, so strategically, so relentlessly, that she had spent the last 6 months of her dying writing me a manual for her life. The recipe tin, with its 12 cards arranged in a precise order. The folder of supplier contacts, every name annotated with notes about which ones to trust. The sealed envelope with the lawyer's number on the back. The freezer in the corner of the back kitchen that Diane had paid the electric bill on for 5 years, grumbling about the cost every time, never once asking what was inside it. What was actually there was a community of people on Linden Street who had been waiting, quietly and without ceremony, for 5 years, for someone to walk back through that front door. They had not held a vigil. They had not started a petition. They had simply been waiting, the way a town waits for spring, without certainty, without timeline, but without ever quite giving up. What was actually there was a freezer humming patiently in the dark, year after year, keeping a powder blue tin cold for a girl who didn't yet know she was going to need it. I think that's what inheritance really is. Not a number, not a building, not even a recipe. It's the proof, left in cold storage, in a folder, in a sealed envelope, in the handwriting of someone who is no longer here, that you were loved before you knew you were going to need to be reminded. Diane sold the house. Eventually, the big house in the suburbs that my mother had grown up in, that had passed Diane after their parents died, that I had spent so many awkward Christmases in as a child. I don't know where she lives now. We don't speak. The last conversation we had was in the lawyer's office, and she said something about how she hoped I knew what I was doing, and I said I didn't, and that was the end of it. I do not wish her ill, and I do not wish her well, and I have made my peace with the fact that some people are simply whether you have to walk through to get to the rest of your life. I used to be angry about her, angry about the years of small cruelties, the way she spoke about my mother after the funeral, the way she tried to talk me out of every single decision I made about the bakery. I'm not angry anymore. Anger is heavy, and I needed both hands free to roll out dough. The bakery, in case you are wondering, is still open. Sunday hours, 8 to 2. Linden Street, the same green awning, the same bell above the door that rings the same way it rang when I was a child. The chalkboard menu is in my own handwriting now. I tried for a while to imitate hers, and then I stopped because it felt dishonest. But on the bottom, every Sunday, I still write the line she used to write. Sunday special, ask Maya. I always have one ready. Sometimes it's a real pastry, a galette with whatever fruit was best at the market that week, a brown butter financier, a small loaf of something I'm experimenting with. Sometimes it's a cookie with too many sprinkles. The kids who come in with their parents on Sunday mornings think the line is for them, and I let them think it. Last week, a little girl, maybe 6, in a yellow raincoat too big for her, asked me very seriously if she could be the Sunday special. I told her absolutely yes, she could, and I gave her a cinnamon roll in the house, and her father, who looked tired in the way that only fathers of small children look tired, the particular exhaustion of loving someone more than your body can sustain, started to argue, and then stopped and just looked at me for a long second and said, very quietly, "Thank you." And I thought, he says it by coming back, Maya. And I knew he would. If this story reached you, if you have ever been told that what you inherited was nothing, when in fact it was everything, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about the person who left you something the world couldn't see. Tell me about the freezer, the drawer, the box in the attic, the recipe card, the letter you weren't ready to read. We all carry these things. We all become, eventually, the person who has to open them. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's not too late, that they're not too young, that the dough doesn't care they're tired, that the dough just wants a rise. Thank you for listening. I'm Maya. I'm Helen's daughter, and I'm finally home.